Sok b'divrei Torah, praised are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who commands us to engage in the study of Torah. So before we get into this week's Torah portion, it's a great one. Most of them are, but this one is especially great. Tu B'Shvat is coming up this weekend, and one thing that I recently learned about that I wanted to share with you, I just shared this with the fourth graders too with a video, which I will not share with you. But did you know that the largest living organism in the world is not a blue whale, but it is a grove, 106 acres large, an aspen grove in Utah. And it is an organism that is thought to be over 80,000 years old, came from one seed, and there are 47,000, basically we would call them trees, but they technically are stems from one root source that over the course of 106 acres, it's called Pando, P-A-N-D-O, so you can always look it up on your own if you want to. Maybe I'll just put it in the chat so you can look it up. But the Pando clone forest in Utah, and it's a pretty phenomenal place, and it's the largest organism. And of course, Tu B'Shvat is the birthday of the trees, and we tend to focus on the trees being the focal point, being the things that the tree gives us, right? Air, of course, and fruits and vegetables and wood and all of that. But when we think about the fact that we call the Torah Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, really, I think it's not only the fruits of the Torah that we benefit from, but it's this idea of the root system. So much about what happens in trees is what's happening below the surface. Just like the human experience, if we think about it, so much of what is going on is happening within us, emotionally, spiritually, even physiologically. So much that is not necessarily seen by the outside world, but that is essential to the survival and thriving of both the tree and us as individuals. And then, therefore, of course, the Jewish people, right? This idea that a root system, a way in which we are interconnected, the way in which we have that foundational connection with one another that then allows the fruits and benefits of a tradition to blossom and thrive. So a little bit about Pando. Oh, yes, Brad.
Can I share a fascinating fact that I learned recently about trees?
Please.
Trees actually grow faster as they age. So I think there's a message for us senior citizens in this group about our ability also to grow as we age.
Wonderful. Amen to that. Yes. Any other fun tree facts that anyone has they want to share? No? Okay. Well, with that, let's get to our Eitz Chaim, our tree of life. And this week we have Beshalach, the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam. This is called Shabbat Shirah. Tonight, if you tune in to services, Rabbi Nanis and Cantor Gurney are going to do a special Shabbat. There's a special tune to the way in which we chant the Song of the Sea. But there's a lot more to this Torah portion than just the crossing of the sea itself. That's the most famous part of this Torah portion, and probably one of the most famous parts of the Exodus narrative in general. And of course, if you look at a Torah scroll, you will see that it's even kind of graphically and artistically representing kind of two walls of water and a pathway in between. And in the middle of the Song of the Sea, we have Micha Mocha, which of course is the prayer that we offer every day. So the whole Micha Mocha prayer is not a part of the Song of the Sea, but the opening line is found in the Song of the Sea in this week's Torah portion. But there's a lot more around this Torah portion that I wanted to focus on. And I always bring more information than we ever get to. So we'll just slowly go through it and see how much we get to. But just to kind of recap, we are now leaving Egypt and starting that journey. So we're not really even the Jewish people yet, but we're about to go through this transitional moment where we are going to cross the sea emotionally and of course physically, but even the opening line is interesting of the Torah portion. So I am also going to, actually I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for 1 minute so I can put this in in the chat in case you want to have a copy of this PDF for later. So just give me 1 second while I find it under all this. Hold on 1 second. Here we go. I will put it in the chat so you can download it and either follow along or use it later, but I will share my screen. So the opening line of this week's Torah portion, Exodus 13:17, says, "Now when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer. For God said, 'The people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt.'" Right, so the rabbis have a question already in the very beginning. Anyone have an idea, without looking down below necessarily, what do you think the rabbis find interesting about this opening line, even more so, the first couple of phrases? Any ideas on what potentially was baffling for the rabbis? No? Okay, I'll just share then. Well, a couple of things. One, when Pharaoh let the people go, right, it's giving credit, interestingly enough, the Torah seems to be giving credit to Pharaoh, who of course was the person who was enslaving the Jews and over again did not let the people go. Of course, one could argue, well, he is the one who finally told them, please leave. But the tradition kind of has trouble with the idea that it wasn't God who really helped release these people. God was the one, of course, who brought all of the plagues. So why is Pharaoh getting credit here for actually letting the people go? And then, secondly, why did God not just take the Jews through the easiest route to the land of Israel? If the whole point is to go back to our promised land, why not take the easiest route? Now it says the people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. But one could also argue, well, doesn't God have the power, just since God just brought all these plagues on Egypt, to make sure that they had a clear path? I mean, even later in this Torah portion, we see that God does a miracle and splits the sea. So why wouldn't God just take the easier path? So these are a couple things that stand out even in this opening line. Why Pharaoh and why not the easier path? And also, what was it about seeing war that would cause the Israelites to want to return to Egypt after they were just enslaved? Wouldn't they just want to take every opportunity possible to stay away from Egypt? So the Midrash there are many interpretations, but here's one of them. And it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go. Why does this scriptural portion open with this verse? Right? This is a significant Torah portion. Why is it starting with this? Because the mouth, meaning Pharaoh, that had declared, "And moreover, I will not let Israel go," meaning when the person who had said, "I'm never going to let them go," actually now retracted and said, "I will let you go." He said it in the last week's Torah portion. This explains why this portion of Scripture begins with the words, "when Pharaoh had let the people go." Okay, so this is part one. So what is being suggested here, and this is something that comes up in earlier Torah portions when we talk about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, right, which has always been a troubling passage for me. Interestingly, though, maybe you already knew this, the first few plagues, Pharaoh hardens his own heart, and it says Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then the last plagues, the second half, is when God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And the rabbis seem to suggest that this has to do with this idea that there's a certain point at which you can potentially do tshuva and do some repentance, but there's a certain point where you cross a line where it's just not possible, where the damage that you've done is irreparable. And so maybe that was the process that was happening as Pharaoh and then God was hardening Pharaoh's heart. And here what they seem to be suggesting is that there is still the opportunity for tshuva, right? Even though this is not the section of the Torah where we are talking about the high holidays, it's not even the time of year where we're thinking about the high holidays, though we on the clergy are already thinking about high holidays, actually. But we are not in the time of year where we're focused on that. And yet here there seems to be this idea that even Pharaoh had a change of heart, and that the Torah is trying to remind us that tshuva is a real significant and possible pathway for everyone. Okay, so that's one thing. And then it goes on. What was his reward for doing this? Thou shalt not abhor an Egyptian. So now the rabbis are connecting this to Deuteronomy 23, which comes a lot later in the Torah. For the mouth that he had said, "I know not the Lord," reversed itself and declared the Lord is righteous. That even Pharaoh had started off by saying, I don't believe in God, and then later on said, God is righteous. So what was his reward for saying this? He gave them a burial place at his said, they stretchest out thy right hand, the earth swallowed them. And that's a reference to a little later on in this Torah portion when, if you remember, the Israelites are able to cross the sea, but then Pharaoh and all the Egyptians are caught in that water, and the water comes down around them. And the major part of a major section of this Torah portion is called the Song of the Sea, where there's basically a poem that talks about kind of the sea coming over the Egyptians, and one of the lines is, and it becomes their burial place. So interestingly, in this midrash, puts Pharaoh in it, kind of allows Pharaoh to go through a process of tshuva, that even the most evil character up until this point has gone through a process where he was able to recognize the value of changing his perspective. He was able to recognize the power of God, and he even gets a reward, which is, instead of them just being all the Egyptians left to die, around the town and around the grounds, instead they were actually technically buried because the water came over them, and they actually had a burial. So I found this to be interesting that the rabbis are taking this different tack on Pharaoh at the start of this Torah portion, just as we are leaving Egypt. Any thoughts or comments on this part so far? Yes, David.
I always feel that these interpretations feel like a stretch. I mean, I get it, but I mean, really. Another interpretation really simply is the straight way out of Egypt is up through what is now Gaza, and Egypt had a lot of soldiers there. So when there's reference to the war, it's like we're not going to lead the Jews right into an ambush. Conversely, God sets up an ambush for the Egyptians by taking them right. So, because the Pharaoh says in the next passage, they're screwed in the desert, right? They're lost in the wilderness. Let's go get them. I changed my mind. Let's go get them. So, I mean, it's not that the interpretation isn't interesting, but,
Yeah,
the direct interpretation is sort of fun too. So anyway, that's my own.
I completely agree. Yes, both are important, right? And yes, we can't ignore the direct interpretations for sure, right? And that you also, on a more direct line, don't want to take a people who have just been enslaved into a war zone, because then they are going to feel more likely to want to turn around and go back to what felt comfortable to them. And then on a deeper level, in an interpretive level, you could see it as this is also representative of the entire journey that they're about to have for the next 40 years, right? There is no straight path to freedom, to redemption. The miracle itself of the sea splitting is not going to be the end-all be-all of what it means to actually find freedom. You don't find redemption through miracles. You actually have to find redemption through the arduous path, slogging through the desert. That if we're relying on miracles, then we're wasting our time. Because as we'll see, the Israelites start to complain right away when they're out in the desert, right? And the miracle, and right after the miracle of the sea splitting, they have no problem complaining, right? So it's not that the miracle all of a sudden changed their perspective. And if we think about it in our own lives, right, there can be some miraculous things that happen that may shift our perspective, but we can't rely on a miracle to necessarily change the trajectory of how we interact with the world. We have to really slog through it. But David, thank you for pointing out the reality, the more realistic interpretation. Any other thoughts on this part? Okay, let's keep going then, because there's plenty more. Okay, Rashi kind of talks about it would be therefore be easy to return by the same route to Egypt. Okay, so let's keep going. And this comes right on the tail of the opening verse, which is, and Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had exacted an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will be sure to take notice of you, then you shall carry up my bones from here with you. So, right, so on one level, of course, Moses is fulfilling an obligation that he is taking the bones of Joseph with him, just as Joseph had asked. So he's fulfilling a promise here. And what the Sforno does is say any obligation undertaken communally must be honored by the leader of that community when the time and opportunity presents itself to discharge that obligation. Right? So Sforno is focusing on the idea that Moses here does something very important. Right? Some of the Midrashim talk about when all the Israelites were just gathering their own stuff and trying to get out of Egypt, what was Moses doing? He was trying to find Joseph's bones so that he could take them with him. Right? Of all the things that Moses could have been doing, that was his focus. That here, the role of the leader of taking on communal responsibility, the obligation to hold the weight and bear the brunt of the responsibilities of an entire community. That's what Moses is doing here. And then there's another interpretation where at that moment the casket of Joseph began to tremble, whereupon Moses, having revealed his place, took it and brought it to him. And during all the years that Israel was in wilderness, the ark of Joseph was carried side by side with the ark of the Shekhinah. Right? So the ark of the Shekhinah here is a reference to the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary, which we'll learn about a little later on in the book of Exodus, where they talk about building the tabernacle and all that goes into building the tabernacle. And that, of course, is the Ark of the Covenant that goes with them throughout the journey. And here, according to this, is this idea that there were actually two things traveling side by side. There was the Ark of the Covenant, but at the same time, there was the Ark of Joseph that was always there right next to the Ark of the Covenant. And this caused all passersby to ask, what is the reason for these two arks? And when they were told that one contained a dead body and the other the Shekhinah, the inquirers would ask, how is it that a dead body is to be placed near the Ark of the Shekhinah? Because usually you want to keep death away from the holiness, right? There's a lot of rules about separating life and death. Whereupon they were told, this is because the one who lies in the ark has fulfilled everything that is written in the Torah, which is placed in the other ark, right? So on another level, they're talking about that the value of living a life of honor and of values is so important that it's worthy of being next to the Ark of the Covenant. That it's almost, the way I like to read this is that we should all hope that at the end of our life we have lived a life worthy of going next to the Ark of the Covenant. That everything that the Ark of the Covenant represents, which is the Torah, that we should be able to be side by side with that ark as well. And Joseph seems to have been representative of that. Any thoughts on this? Yes, Merle.
Does this have anything to do with why a Kohen isn't supposed to go to a funeral?
Yes, and those come later on. The rules,
Okay.
mostly in Leviticus, that talk about the limitations of the Kohanim and what they can and can't do. And there's a lot of discussion about dead bodies and death and whether or not a Kohen can go to a funeral, etc. Yeah, so that comes later on.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about this idea of Joseph's bones going alongside the Ark of the Covenant? Have you heard this before? And David?
Well, it's also, the Torah says there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. So let's say it's a couple hundred years since Joseph was there. So by taking his remains, it ties the current Jewish community to the patriarchal Jewish community and links the history of the people way back in time. And you can actually look at the Ark of the Covenant as a promise of what you're gonna get, right? Do this, you're gonna get that. But Joseph is a representative of what you've come through already. So it's both spiritually and intellectually and just practically, it's a link to both parts of the history.
Wonderful. Thank you. Love that. Yes, Susan.
I love that too. The other thing is the other patriarchs are buried in the cave of Machpelah. And here's a leader who's not, I've always wondered why Joseph wasn't considered a patriarch too, because he had done so much. So this is I think a beautiful thing. It's the first time I've heard it. Of the Shekhinah and being carried to the new land.
Great. Anyone else? I think, and partly personally, because I'm dealing with the potential loss of someone in my family soon, I'm thinking about also, what does it mean for someone to be honored after they die? And what is our responsibility of carrying them with us, and carrying, not, of course, not their remains, but their values, right? This is about what Joseph represents, just as David and Susan alluded to, this, what Joseph represented for the Jewish people and what he did for the Jewish people is being brought along into the future as a reminder to these people who are lost in many ways. That one of the ways that we can try and navigate the difficulties of our own journeys is to rely on the memories and the bones and the foundation that come from those who brought wisdom and who got us to where we are today, and that bringing them along with us can actually give us some strength as we continue to wander and meander through the desert.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. I'm sorry I'm late. I just realized, oh my gosh, it's time to listen to you today. God bless
Welcome,
you.
Donna. Thanks for
Thank
being
you
here.
so much. I was talking to the AJC and the email
All
to
right.
Mr. Rosen, so.
Welcome. All right, let's keep going. Okay, now we're moving on to another thing that another passage that comes up throughout the journey, which is this idea that Adonai went before them in a pillar of cloud by day and to guide them along the way, and a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel day and night. I just thought, I didn't bring any interpretations on this. I think we can find our own. But this idea that there was this, the force of God was with them, and also this pillar of cloud is what actually allows there to be a separation as the Israelites are trying to get into the water. That kind of a smoke screen, so to speak, where it gives the Israelites time to get through the water while the Egyptians are kind of lost and straggling before they can pursue in the water itself. But this is something that comes up throughout the journey, and this idea that there was the fire of guidance at night and the pillar of cloud by day. It's something that this kind of physical manifestation of God always being with the Jewish people. I think it's not something that we necessarily as modern Jews necessarily rely on physical representations of God kind of guiding us on a regular basis, but could the natural world, or are there things that we see in our world that we could connect as godly guideposts for us? This text seems to support that idea.
Rabbi, I don't want to interrupt. I'm going to be polite, but with what you're saying, I find white feathers, and it's not pigeon feathers. It's angels. They're everywhere. And when the rabbi said, when you sing, you're praying twice. Rabbi Luther said that in Manus. So I sing a lot at home because we want to pass that no hate law, and so many bad things are going on. So I see a lot of white feathers everywhere, and I'm not exaggerating. And I don't think that I'm any better than anybody, but I'm like in awe of it. I'm in awe of it. Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you. Right, and Heschel talks about this idea of radical amazement, this idea that can we find God and can we be amazed by the most potentially minor of things in the world, or things that we may just pass by as insignificant, but that if we can actually look toward those minor little minuscule reminders of God in the world around us, we can constantly be in a state of amazement and constantly be in connection to something bigger than ourselves. Okay, so then we get into the Israelites crossing the sea and crossing on dry ground. The water's forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. And so, of course, I wanted to bring the famous midrash about Nachshon. And this is one of the versions. There are a few of them, but it's the famous midrash that talks about this person who went in first into the waters. Rabbi Judah answered Rabbi Meir that in reality no tribe was willing to be the first to go into the sea. Then Nachshon ben Aminadab, stepped forward and went into the sea first, praying in the words of Psalm 69, "Save me, O God, for the waters come into my soul. I sink in deep mire where there is no standing. Let not the water overwhelm me, neither let the deep swallow me up." And Moses was then praying, So God prompted Moses in words parallel those of Exodus 14:15. My beloved ones are drowning in the sea, and you prolong prayer before me. You're focusing on prayer when these people are drowning. Moses asks God, Lord of the universe, what is there in my power to do? What am I supposed to do about these Israelites? How are they supposed to cross the sea? God replied in the words of Exodus 14:15, speak to the children of Israel that they go forward and lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And then the children of Israel shall go into the midst of the sea on dry ground. Because of Nachshon's actions, Judah, because he was from the tribe of Judah, merited becoming the ruling power in Israel. As Psalm 114 says, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion, and that happened because the sea saw him and fled. Right. So this is the famous. I assume many people have heard the story of Nachshon. There are different versions, but this idea that wasn't really Moses lifting the rod that caused the splitting of the sea. And again, the rabbis' discomfort with, as we talked about earlier, the role of miracle as being the saving grace for the Jewish people, that we can't actually rely on miracles, that we actually have to rely on our own abilities. And so therefore, the creation of the story of Nachshon, who goes out into the water, offers these words of the Psalms, his prayer, and only when the water is up past his nostrils so he can't breathe anymore, that's when God helps through Moses to split the sea and the Jews can walk through to the other side. Lisa and then Penina. Still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Hi, I came in late, so sorry. I actually just have a question about what you just said about the rabbis not wanting us to rely on miracles, but wanting us to rely on ourselves. Can you expand on that? Because it's not that I disagree with it, but I mean, it sounds like a reform interpretation, whereas if you spoke to an Orthodox Jew, isn't it all about God's miracles for them? That just struck me as very interesting, and also I'm confused.
Yes. So it's not that miracles, for example, we are supposed to say the Nisim B'chol Yom every morning. There's a set of blessings called the daily miracles, right? So it's not that we are to negate the value of miracles, but to rely on our redemption and rely on our future, to rely on miracles to help us get through life is not what the rabbis were uncomfortable with that. So, these would be rabbis a long time ago who I guess would be considered Orthodox in today's world who came up with this midrash. It wasn't liberal Jews today who came up with this.
Right.
And the idea is that not only can you read this interpretation as, number one, they wanted to figure out why Judah was later on going to be the leader of Israel, but also they're trying to understand, okay, if we're going to try and get through the rough parts of our lives and rough parts of history, we know that unfortunately miracles have not saved the Jewish people all the time. There's been a lot of strife and challenge. And how can we make sure that we give some credit and put some power behind individual ability to make a difference, right? And so that's one of the reasons. It's not that miracles don't happen. It's not that we should believe that miraculous things can occur. But if we're in a situation, we're not, there's the joke, well, it wasn't actually a joke. There's one of the jokes where, there's a guy sitting, there's a flood, he sits on the roof of his house, right? And first the boat comes and he says, no, I'm waiting for God, right? And then the helicopter comes and finally he dies and says, well, and God says, I sent 3 different people to you.
Right. What else do you want from me?
What else do you want from me? So again, that's a joke about a man waiting for miracles to happen, when in fact, right, it was the people who are going to be there, and he had to take agency in actually changing the situation for himself, not relying on God to do that.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah. Phyllis and then Penina.
So I'm interested that there is a person who takes a very dangerous step here, takes it upon himself to move forward when in the desert there's no sign ever that people are willing to do that. And because I think about who these people were, and granted that they were slaves, but they also had abilities. And we don't see those abilities when they're out, complaining about no water or food or anything. So I've been thinking about that a lot.
And abilities, what do you mean by abilities?
Well, so, there's no food, and they didn't have any agency in going out and finding food. There had to be something to eat in the desert, or plants, or, so I'm struck by the fact that there's no, and they couldn't find water. Could they have dug for it? They certainly probably were very strong. That is, I don't know.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and the Midrash, of course, does give agency to this one individual. And there are people who do use their abilities, but not in the way that I would say you're referring to, more in survivalist skills. I think about, as we were talking about the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary. Later on in Exodus, we learn about Bezalel and Oholiab, these people who were master artisans, who actually did use their abilities to be the master and craftsmen of the building of this sanctuary. And later on, there in the beginning of one of the Torah portions, where it talks about people brought gifts from their hearts, and they brought all kinds of things, and they gave of themselves. So it's a different type of use of abilities than what you're referring to. But I would argue there are signs of people trying to bring what they could to the situation. But of course, you also, Phyllis, are referencing a lot of the times where they just complain and seem to be incapable of speaking for themselves, learning for themselves, surviving on their own. And I think that's part of the narrative of what is occurring, both leading up to what happens at Sinai, and then, of course, the rest of the narrative for the rest of the Torah as an example that even when you do have a set of values that can guide you, and you have guideposts to help you figure out how to survive, you're still going to fall off the bandwagon and still complain. So we have to be reminded regularly. But yes, thank you for pointing that out. Penina was next.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So first of all, we know that Moses didn't go to Egypt to get him out. He was away, right? So we know that he was away first. He lived in the desert, he even married in the desert, and he had children in the desert, and he found people with water wells in the desert because he went to help his wife remove the stone or whatever, like Jacob did with Rachel or something, or Rebecca, sorry, with Isaac. He did the same here. And so he lived among them, because we know later on that his father-in-law is joining him and giving him good advice about judging the people. So I saw an experiment years ago. Some archaeologists and some scientists were very occupied with the way that they crossed the sea. And they took an aquarium, a really big one. And it was like 3/4 filled with water. And they blew really big wind in there, strong wind, and the water separated. There was like a path in between that was shallower. And another thing is that they found an archaeologist that were busy with this dead sea that they crossed, that they found that they didn't just cross it in the middle. They crossed it, it was kind of like there is a path that the water wasn't that high. So there was a possibility to cross. And him living there in the area, he must have known, and he must have recognized what's going on around him, because he was a lot more savvy in nature than we are trying to figure out today. He has a lot more, the idea that he took him out in the middle of the month when the moon was full, that's when they left, in the middle of Nisan. The moon was full and the weather was good. And this is the day that they left. We know that. That's what they tell us. So the moon is full, so you got light. So we have to remember that the Torah talk in the language of people. But in order to make people who are not at the time very savvy, maybe involving magic and things that are extraordinary would do the trick to have him follow, because that's what they were accustomed to from where they came from. But we have to look at how people looked at that situation today, not from the rabbis always. The rabbis are having good explanations, but it's mostly spiritual. And those rabbis spend their days in front of the books, and their wives kept a store to make a living, and they were living there forever and ever. And, and I'm not saying that what they're saying is not valid. It's very valid, and it has to do with human nature. But you have to remember also there is an oasis in the desert. And the first thing that we shake on Sukkot, in the sukkah, is the lulav, which is a palm tree that it's been found in the desert and in the oasis. And you also have to remember that they took with them a lot of cows and stuff that the Egyptians even gave them, just get out of there and take what you want. So they did have food in the beginning, and they did course it all out. Then when it was over, I don't know how to explain the manna, so I'm going to give credit to God on that.
Okay. Penina gives credit to God on the manna part.
Yeah.
Everything else,
and
it's
all
all
the
science.
water that they found among the stones, we know today that there are some stones that are,
Yes.
they can hold water. But I'm a great believer that it happened, but how it happened, we have to kind of like research with the tools that we have today to try to understand, and it's possible. The possibility we know was there because they made it.
Yeah,
And they
yeah,
got there.
and Penina, you bring up. Thank you for all of your points.
Right. And I want to just tell you, because of Sukkot, I'm going to make it really quick. The stages of settlement, the lulav is the desert, the travel, because of the palm trees and the oasis. Then they came there and they weren't allowed to even get to the water of the people who lived there already. They weren't allowed. So they went and settled in the mountains. And that's why we have the myrtle in the sukkah. And then the myrtle in Israel grows on the mountains. Then when they were they were involved in many wars, and many of them that they did not start. So they walked their way to the valley. And the valley has water. And that's why you have the weeping willow that you have there, the willow in the 4 kinds. And then they became farmers. And the fruit of their land was the etrog. That's supposed to show a perfect product of working the land, of growing something. And it was actually, in the beginning, it was going in the left bank. But then now today they're going it on both sides. So that just to show you
all the different interpretations.
That there is so many things that you have to look at that could make sense, that made sense. And some archaeologists also found carvings in a cave of the Exodus.
All right. Well, I want to keep going, Penina.
Yeah. Okay. That's it.
You should have your own Torah study, and you could do a whole section on yours. Because you are full of knowledge, and you bring up good points about how there is a debate, and I know Rabbi Wolpe years ago gave a sermon that was very controversial because he said, basically that the Exodus didn't necessarily happen, and that
it happened.
A lot. Nina knows it happened.
Otherwise, the story wouldn't have been there. It happened.
Well, okay, that's up for debate and interpretation. But again, the wonderful thing about our tradition is that we can come from all different angles. Whether it happened or not, there is still meaning and purpose behind it. And we have a whole breadth of ways in which we can interpret the value of these stories.
Absolutely.
Even if we can't,
yes,
we can come from all different understandings of the reality of it. Okay. Let's keep, any other thoughts or questions about Nachshon or the crossing of the sea? It's becoming a much more well-known midrash. I think now all the kids know this story of Nachshon. When I was growing up, no one really talked about Nachshon. So it's also interesting to think about what are the stories that we tell the next generation it's not just the miracle of the sea splitting. Now it's also this idea of Nachshon and the role of and individual agency in bringing about change, and how that even in our Jewish community is we're starting to bring different narratives that didn't necessarily get front and center a generation ago. Okay, moving on. Now there's another famous midrash that I wanted to share, also from this section, that you also may have heard about. And the Gemara, this is from the Talmud, actually. The Gemara comments, as Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman says, that Rabbi Yonatan says, what is the meaning of that which is written in the passage describing the splitting of the Red Sea, and the one came not near the other all the night? So this is referring to the passage right before the splitting of the sea. At that time, the ministering angels desired to recite a song before the Holy One, blessed be He. But the Holy One, blessed be He, said to them, my handiwork, aka the Egyptians, are drowning in the sea, and you are reciting a song before me? Apparently, God is not gladdened by the downfall of the wicked. Right? So this is another famous line that's usually used about that while the angels or while the Israelites were dancing and singing and rejoicing the fact that the Egyptians were drowning, God, according to this passage, was not happy with the destruction of humanity, right? And even if it was the Egyptians, that this is a passage used for God's feeling of compassion, and that God is not the kind of God who wants to destroy, that God is not out to destroy people. That's not God's purpose. So this is one of those passages that is used that also to suggest that even if we are the victors in some kind of battle, it's not our job, nor should we be happy with the loss of life on the other side. That's not something we should necessarily rejoice at. So that's another really important interpretation that we find about the passage of crossing of the sea, because we tend to focus on the joy of the fact that the Israelites got across and the Egyptians drowned, and all the kids know this story and think about, yay, we got rid of the Egyptians, and yet there's this really important notion that God is not necessarily rejoicing in that loss. Lisa.
Yeah, again, I have a question, because I get that, and it's a wonderful, lofty idea, I suppose, and a wonderful way to think about God. But wasn't it God that put us in the situation in the first place of being slaves? And yes, there's all kinds of Talmudic reasons about why we had to go through that, so then we can be better and bigger and blah blah blah. But I mean, was that the only way to do it, where you had to be enslaved and dragging mud rocks and so it just sounds a little overly simplistic given the history, and in this situation the quite recent history. I mean, I get it, we're supposed to think, and you could extrapolate that to a lot of things, again, to the Holocaust or to whatever. God is supposed to be sorry about the loss of life, but then why the hell are we in this situation to begin with?
Yep. Again, great question with a lot of different ways we can go with that. But I will go back to the story of Adam and Eve and this idea of free will, which is a significant part of the Jewish understanding of how the world works, and that God does play some roles, but the majority of what happens in the world is due to humanity and the decisions that humans make, and that the consequences of our decisions and our actions lead to all kinds of things, but that we tend to be a people, even though we do rely on God, we pray to God, but at the same time, so much of what we do relies on our actions, not God's actions. Most of the mitzvot are about how we act. It's not about how God is acting.
Right. But I'm not talking about, I get that, but there are you could point to several major periods in Jewish history of literally victimhood. We didn't choose what Isabella and Ferdinand decided to do. We didn't choose what the Germans decided to do. We didn't choose what the Egyptians decided to do. So I get what you're saying from a rabbinical standpoint and the big picture, but I don't think in a lot of places the Jews have had free will.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, David,
No?
you want to respond? And then Brad.
Would it be fair to say, and I'm just having this thought at the moment, that the Torah is in some sense an aspirational document? It's what we ought to be doing in the face of what is done to us. And therefore it's not just, yeah, I'll leave it there. Is it fair to say it's an aspirational document?
Absolutely. It's not a historical document. It's a theological and an aspirational document. It's supposed to lay out a system of either through story or through law that guides us to make better decisions and to try and improve ourselves in the world around us. And in a realistic way, right? Because Lisa, there are plenty of examples in the Torah of messed up things happening. And so even though they aren't necessarily all true, Penina would argue they're all true, they are true even if they're not factual. Let's differentiate between the two of those things, right? They may not, many of the stories in the Torah may not be factually correct, but they are true. And so they are aspirational in the sense, but I would also say, David, they are also realistic. If we look at Genesis, which we just finished, those types of relationships that exist between family members and between, they are realistic in the sense that there is division and divisiveness and rebellion and lying. Everything that we experience in the world today is a part of those narratives, and it's aspirational because it doesn't necessarily give us all the answers, but it's aspirational in the way we are supposed to interpret it. So, yes, Brad, I know you wanted to add something.
Well, I'm in a different direction. I'm really interested in what I see as a lot of death imagery in this passage. I mean, the sea is a cemetery. We just talked about the coffin of Joseph, the Ark of the Shekinah, in a sense, being compared to a coffin. And then God appears not just as a cloud and as fire, but as a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And I wonder if, I don't know the Hebrew for pillar, if there's some death connotation as well there, as a sort of tombstone type. I don't know if the language is gets us there, but I'm struck by the death imagery that seems to pervade this passage.
Penina, our Hebrew scholar in residence.
I just want to say something that's very important. The Egyptians didn't follow on foot. They went with chariots. It's iron chariots and horses. The chariots still will sink. The Israelites went on foot. You have to consider how the Egyptians follow to understand why they didn't make it. That's it.
Okay, so I thought you were going to answer, Brad. No, there's no. Amud is not. There's not reference.
It means
to,
a pole. Amud means a pole. That's it.
It's not another death image in terms of the pillar itself.
Right.
But you're right. There is a significant amount of death in this Torah portion. References to it, and on the surface, of course, we can see that literally in the story because all the Egyptians die, and I think there's also maybe because what comes right after this is a rebirth. Next week's Torah portion, entitled Yitro, really is the story of the Ten Commandments, right? So there's a rebirth and a birth in general of a new identity that comes next week. So maybe a lot of kind of a forceful imagery of death in this week's Torah portion is also representative of what is being left behind and dying for the Israelite people as they cross over this body of water, and then next week to really be reborn with a new set of values and a new identity that is supposed to actually guide them throughout the rest of their journey. So that could be another interpretation. Ben, and then Susan, and then back to Lisa.
I don't have anything.
Thank you.
Oh, you don't have anything? Okay.
No.
Thank you, Rabbi. Death.
Sorry.
Death is such a part of life. So here we have it as an important storytelling metaphor in that we talked about how when the Egyptians die, God doesn't take any joy in it. That it's his people, they're all his people, and there's sadness in that. And then just going back to Moses and the bones, and why that attention to detail of collecting those bones, and is it as a leader, had all these other things to think about, but he said he was going to do it, and then he did it. So it shows something important as well. So there's other reasons why death is important, and it's used to convey other parts of the story.
Great. Thank you, Benjamin. Susan.
I was struck by the coffin of business. And yes, that enclosure is coffin-like. But on the other hand, it also can be a nurturing thing. It was Noah's Ark, and the Ark of the Covenant, which is upright, and the sense of a womb. So I think there's a lot of metaphors here for death and rebirth. And the Ark can be looked at as, the coffin image that Brad talked about could be looked at also as an ark and as for protection and the shield. And then for the Torah, it's saving the Torah and protecting it from all the outside elements. So symbols can be a double whammy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susan. Merle.
I'm thinking about what you just said about rebirth, and it dawned on me that we read Torah over, we start it over every year, and in a way that's a rebirth of our thinking about how do we manage ourselves now and whatever happens this year or that last year or whatever. But I'm also thinking about that when we have children, or when our children have children, and we name our children or they name our grandchildren, we're naming them after, in most cases, they're named after someone that was very important to them. And that, to me, even with Torah, that's another type of rebirth that we hope we hope we're naming them after people whose values they inherit.
Wonderful. And in a nice way, I feel like you brought us back to where we started, which is what I was talking about, Tu B'Shvat, and how the Torah is called Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, right? And how, regardless of any symbolism of death, what we are supposed to find in these texts is a sense of life and vitality and a rejuvenation. That every Torah portion and every year is an opportunity for us to look deep into these texts and to find ways in which they can enliven our souls and our lives. So with that, I want to wish you all, we've come to the end of our hour. So wishing you all a wonderful Shabbat Shalom and a nice Tu B'Shvat this weekend. There's a tradition, in addition to having a Tu B'Shvat Seder, which is very nice if you haven't done one, very simple, and you can look up how to do that online. But it's also a tradition to find a fruit that you haven't had yet. Either you haven't had this year, or maybe you've never had. There's always now the sections in most grocery stores where you can find kind of the exotic fruit section. So maybe this week you find one of those exotic fruits that you haven't tried before. You haven't had one in a year, and the tradition is also to try something new, a new fruit as well on Tu B'Shvat. So to newness and rejuvenation and vitality, and Shabbat Shalom to all of you. Thanks for being here. It's great to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good Shabbos. Bye-bye.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye. Bye.